In 2010, Boeing hoped to complete a crewed Starliner mission by 2015, but yet the Starliner has simply seen delay after delay and failure after failure. Meanwhile, SpaceX has been making tremendous progress in terms of Crew Dragon. The company already completed 7 crewed missions using Crew Dragon, and Crew Dragon will only be used more frequently moving forward. But is Boeing's Starliner a complete failure? Well, hang on till the end of this video as we rip off everything we can tell you about Boeing Starliner line by line, word by word. Frankly, not a failure. The Starliner program has just been a disaster in all aspects. First, it's actually painful to remember that NASA dumped $4.2 billion of taxpayer money onto Boeing to build this spacecraft. Furthermore, in an award that NASA's own Inspector General described as unnecessary, NASA paid Boeing an additional $287.2 million. This brings Boeing's total to $4.49 billion. For the same services, the development of Crew Dragon and 6 operational missions, NASA paid SpaceX $2.6 billion. After its initial award, NASA has agreed to buy additional 8 flights from SpaceX, Crew 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, all through the year 2030. This brings the total contract awarded to SpaceX to $4.93 billion. Since we know now how many flights each company will be providing NASA through the lifetime of the ISS and the full cost of those contracts, we can break down the price NASA's paying each company per seat by amortizing the development cost. Boeing, in flying 27 astronauts, has a per-seat price of $183 million. SpaceX, in flying 56 astronauts during the same time frame, has a seat price of $88 million. Thus, NASA is paying Boeing 2.1 times the price per seat than they're paying SpaceX, inclusive of development cost incurred by NASA. What a ridiculous expense! The important thing is that Boeing Starliner is stuck on the ground. In other words, Starliner has not transported an astronaut yet. Spacecraft really just has a history of error. Starliner's development has proven to be a long, bumpy ride. In 2019, the capsule could not be placed in the correct orbit because of a clock problem and had to return to Earth after 2 days. Boeing then realized that other software concerns had nearly led to a serious flight anomaly. NASA prescribed a long list of recommendations and modifications to be made. Then in 2021, as the rocket was about to be sent into orbit from the launch pad, a humidity problem caused a chemical reaction preventing the opening of some of the capsule valves. It was sent back to the factory for inspection, where it stayed for 10 months. It was not until just a few months ago that Boeing Starliner spacecraft finally docked at the International Space Station for the first time, but not without a glitch. At this point, Boeing Starliner has a crewed test flight set early next year, likely February. Its first operational mission will not come before the second half of 2023. Now, to be fair, let's dive into the design of Starliner itself. Disappointedly, Boeing is making technology that looked the same as many decades ago. It can't be compared to the modern SpaceX Dragon. The Crew Dragon 2 has a better heat shield that would enable it to be used for faster re-entry back to Earth, thus enabling it to function beyond LEO that the ISS is in. Importantly, even if Boeing succeeds fully, which we truly hope they do, they'll only be able to produce 2 launches per year. Its one-use throwaway rocket system built from legacy parts out of the Space Shuttle. SpaceX redesigned their rockets and Crew Dragon capsule from the ground up by reverse engineering old engines, systems, etc., and radically improving each area with 21st century interfaces, materials, and know-how. Now let's talk about the size and capacity aspect. The Starliner capsule is a silver, somewhat squat, broad-base cone shape, coming in at just over 17 feet tall and just under 15 feet in diameter. The completely autonomous Starliner is required to carry 4 NASA crew members and scientific research when it eventually travels to the ISS. Meanwhile, a Dragon is more elongated, candy-white, cone-shaped capsule, 26.5 feet tall and a diameter just greater than 13 feet, with 11 cubic meters of internal volume. It makes parachute-aided splashdowns in the ocean when its work in orbit is done. It is fully autonomous but can be monitored and controlled by both onboard astronauts and SpaceX Mission Control in Hawthorne, California. It has two main elements: the capsule, which carries crew and cargo, and the trunk, and 3 windows. Its astronaut-specific amenities include 4 big windows, advanced avionics, computer systems, and touchscreen displays, including controls for interior temperature that can be set between 18 to 27 degrees Celsius, and of course, seats. Crew Dragon is outfitted with an emergency escape system, which consists of 8 Super Draco engines built into the capsule wall. If something goes wrong at any point during a Crew Dragon flight, these engines can fire up and take the spacecraft and passengers to safety. Starliner's emergency escape system contains 4 launch abort engines built into the capsule's service module. Boeing performed a hot fire test of these engines, which were provided by aerospace company Aerojet Rocketdyne, but they detected a propellant leak shortly after. Dragon's technology definitely is a big humiliation with Starliner. After all, Starliner blows the reputation of the aerospace industry and a setback to NASA. The legacy aerospace giant has been crippled by years of bad news about Starliner. For decades following the Cold War, Boeing was known for its engineering excellence, with its mastery showing up in innovative bombers and other military planes. Unfortunately, somewhere a shift happened, and those years of technical know-how fell under question after 2 fatal 737 crashes in 2019. Then a software problem on Starliner put an onboard clock off by 11 hours, leading the computer to think it was at an entirely different point in the mission, which caused the spacecraft to fire its engines incorrectly and waste fuel. The fallout from the capsule calamity in 2019 allowed Musk's scrappy upstart SpaceX to leave Boeing in the stardust, with at least 5 manned missions to the ISS under its belt before Boeing has even made one. Importantly, Starliner screw-ups put NASA's relationship with Boeing to the test. One software problem was found and fixed mid-flight. Another potentially more hazardous glitch was discovered once the capsule landed in the New Mexico desert. NASA and Boeing undertook a joint investigation to figure out why the mistakes happened. It contributed to the firing of CEO Dennis Muhlenberg, and after the flawed flight, the company also replaced its Starliner program manager with a new executive. 80 software tweaks later, NASA said Boeing could try again, but this time it's on Boeing's dime. The relationship was officially broken. Let's hope that Boeing executives think they can do a better job on their next fixed-price assignment, or at least feel NASA's generous payments for building the Space Launch System to make up some of Starliner's loss. The U.S. Space Agency needs a competitor for SpaceX, and thus far, none of the obvious contenders have stepped up to the plate. Boeing has the capital and experience, but today, they just need to prove they can execute. As Boeing Starliner wouldn't perform the first crewed mission test until next year, NASA has officially awarded all the final flights needed to keep the space station fully occupied into the year 2030 for the SpaceX Dragon. Well, the question is NASA finally giving up on Boeing Starliner? Well, let's talk about it all in today's episode at Alpha Tech Channel. On September 1st, NASA has awarded 5 additional missions to SpaceX for crew transportation services to the ISS as part of the agency's Commercial Crew Transportation Capability contract, taking the company's total contracted missions for Crew Dragon astronaut capsule to 14. The deal, which will employ SpaceX's Crew Dragon spacecraft and Falcon 9 rockets, allows NASA to maintain an uninterrupted U.S. capability for human access to the space station through 2030, NASA officials have said in an update. The latest boost to SpaceX's NASA contract is also part of the agency's effort to ensure a steady run of astronaut flights to the space station, as Boeing, the other company with a similar crew transportation contract, has struggled to complete the development of its Starliner space capsule. The pack will cover missions Crew 10 through Crew 14, representing approximately 20 spacecraft seats overall. SpaceX's Crew 5 is expected to launch in early October, and Crew 4 is at the space station as of now. SpaceX also received a trio of astronaut flights from NASA in December as part of a sole source modification to its Commercial Crew Transportation Capabilities contract, which was first awarded in 2014. SpaceX's crew transportation system is the only one certified to meet NASA's safety requirements to transport crew to the space station and to maintain the agency's obligation to its international partners in the needed time frame, agency officials said at the time. SpaceX's CCT-CAP deal is now worth a total of $4.9 billion, NASA officials said in today's update. A quick note here for you, NASA is going to pay Boeing a total of approximately $5.1 billion for 6 crew flights and will pay SpaceX a total of $4.9 billion for 14 flights. It's too wild, isn't it? But we've got to accept the reality. NASA anticipates a potential need to use additional SpaceX flights as early as 2026 to ensure dissimilar redundancy, maintain safe space station operations, and allow each company to work through any unforeseen issues that could arise as the private industry builds operational experience with these new systems. SpaceX is currently NASA's only certified commercial crew transportation provider. The company will fly its 6th rotational mission for NASA in the spring of 2023. While SpaceX is celebrating with this new award, what about Boeing Starliner? Is this the end for Boeing? Well, it's completely reasonable with what Starliner completed compared with SpaceX's Dragon. The company recently completed a largely successful uncrewed test flight in May, but that's just success in itself. The flight still had many errors. Looking ahead, Boeing will make a crewed flight test of Starliner in 2023 and then fly its first operational mission or possibly later if issues are discovered on the crewed test flight. Boeing's Orbital Flight Test 2 went very well, and we hope to be able to certify the Starliner system in the near future, says Phil McAllister, Director of Commercial Space at NASA. He said this in an agency news release. However, we will need additional missions from SpaceX to implement our strategy of having each commercial provider flying alternating missions once per year. So far, NASA has yet to announce the purchase of additional Starliner missions. This seems prudent, as Boeing has yet to fully demonstrate Starliner's capability with the crew on board. But based on the number of this week's announcement, it seems probable there are no additional crewed missions awarded to Boeing. Why? Because NASA only plans to fly 2 crewed space station missions a year with 4 astronauts aboard each. SpaceX contracted for 9 additional missions, and Boeing has 6 on the books. There are 8 years of life left in the space station if it stops flying in 2030. While additional modifications to these contracts are always possible, NASA appears to have booked all the rides it needs for a station lifetime into 2030. This doesn't necessarily mean that Starliner will fly just 6 crewed missions. Boeing signaled its intent to also use the vehicle for private astronaut missions, likely to commercial space stations under development. For example, Boeing is a partner on Blue Origin's Orbital Reef space station project. At present, Starliner is only capable of flying on ULA's Atlas V rocket, so Boeing has only secured enough launches to complete its original 6 operational Starliner missions for NASA before the Atlas V rocket is retired. NASA's Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel raised concerns about how delays in Starliner's development might affect the availability of the Atlas V at its May 12th meeting. Any further delay with Starliner launches would exacerbate this concern, said David West, a member of the panel, especially adding that certifying Vulcan for crewed launches, quote, could take years. At a May 17th pre-launch briefing, NASA and ULA officials said that all the remaining Starliner missions under contract, including CFT and the 6 post-certification missions, would remain on Atlas V regardless of schedule. From a resource perspective, we have measures in place to protect the talent and to ensure we retain the critical skills to be able to fly an Atlas as late as we need to, said Gary Wentz, Vice President of Government and Commercial Program at ULA. We're in conversations with Boeing and other customers for that capability. Even at a pace of 1 mission per year, though, and with no other customers for Starliner, the supply of Atlas vehicles would be exhausted before the projected retirement of the ISS in 2030. We would look toward the end of the decade to award other flights or have other flights potentially for Boeing, says Steve Stitch, NASA Commercial Crew Program Manager. We would look for a new system, he added. NASA would support human rating a new system when Boeing and ULA are ready. ULA has not announced plans to human rate Vulcan. However, Wentz said that over 90% of the Vulcan Centaur hardware is already flying on Atlas V, simplifying any human rating process. One key change, he said, would be transferring the emergency detection system currently on Atlas, which alerts the spacecraft of any problems with the rocket to trigger its abort system to Vulcan. The other major change, he said, would be human rating the BE-4 engines used on Vulcan's first stage. Boeing may not be the only customer or even the first to seek the human rating of Vulcan. Sierra Space is planning a crewed version of its Dream Chaser cargo spacecraft. The cargo version will launch on Vulcan rockets starting in 2023, and a crewed version could be ready as soon as 2026. That's just theory. The reality is definitely much further away. When there was the beginning of the space cargo and crew programs, the two serious bidders were SpaceX and Boeing, and everybody poo-pooed SpaceX and said, oh, Boeing is a legacy company. Well, guess who is about to make its sixth flight after its first test flight with astronauts? And guess who's still on the ground? Yep, you probably won't believe it, but this is exactly what NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, who once didn't take SpaceX seriously, just declared. Perhaps he's finally put prejudice aside and realizes Starliner is just too bad to compare with Dragon. In 2011, NASA ended its space shuttle program with high costs, slow turnaround, and safety problems that led to the fatal Challenger and Columbia disasters among the factors of its demise. Since then, NASA's resorted to purchasing rocket trips to and from the ISS from Russia. Keen to restore spaceflight to the U.S. soil in 2014, NASA awarded two huge contracts worth $6.8 billion to Boeing and SpaceX, with the aim of getting crew to the ISS independently once again. Right out of the gate, Boeing got better treatment from NASA. Everyone thought that Starliner would launch before Dragon, but the result was pitiful. SpaceX has since launched multiple NASA-funded crew missions to the ISS, while Boeing, also a private company, has yet to carry a human in its Starliner capsule. Most recently, NASA and SpaceX even signed a Space Act agreement to study the feasibility of boosting the orbit of the iconic Hubble Space Telescope, potentially ensuring that the highly successful observatory will remain operable well into the middle of this century. A fair burn to Boeing, which has in short been absolutely eating SpaceX dust for over a decade. But it was a bit of a self-burn as well, seeing as how by many accounts Nelson himself was one of those early SpaceX poo-pooers. Clearly what SpaceX has achieved is far more than enough for the world to admire. Even Nelson now admitted, quote, I think the private space industry is extremely beneficial. Just look at what SpaceX has already accomplished. This isn't the first time that the head NASA honcho has glossed over his history of SpaceX ambivalence. At his NASA nomination hearing back in 2021, Nelson argued that though a series of laws dating back to the mid-'80s, he personally, quote, laid the foundation for the emergence of the modern commercial space sector. But according to former colleagues and U.S. Senate minutes, Nelson hasn't always been such a fan of privatized space travel industry, or for that matter, of mercurial SpaceX CEO Elon Musk. Back in 2010, when Nelson was still a senator, he was an extremely vocal opponent, or a poo-pooer, if you will, of a Senate push to fund these commercial crew missions into the cosmos, as corroborated by allegations from former NASA second-in-command Lori Garver in her recently published memoir. In the same memoir, Garvin also claimed that Nelson once, quote, screamed at me to get your boy Elon in line, end quote. Nelson's save-face efforts aren't terribly surprising, given SpaceX's prominent success. SpaceX was founded in March of 2002 by Elon Musk. It almost never happened. Between 2006 and 2008, its first three rocket launch attempts all failed, putting it on the edge of bankruptcy. The fourth, it succeeded, but only after Musk scraped together just enough money to finance it. Musk had made a name for himself by voicing lofty ambitions for the company. He espoused self-landing, reusable, cheap rockets, and a wider goal of enabling humanity to become multiplanetary by colonizing Mars. In 2012, SpaceX launched its first cargo delivery to the ISS, and in 2014 it was co-awarded the aforementioned NASA contract, with NASA's Commercial Crew Program member Kathy Lueders telling reporters, Boeing and SpaceX proposed the value within which they were able to do the work, and the government accepted that. In May 2022, SpaceX was valued at $127 billion. Its Starlink network of thousands of internet satellites is well underway, with over 3,000 in orbit. On August 30th, it launched its 39th Falcon 9 rocket of 2022, the company's workhorse reusable launch vehicle, and it's on a mission to deliver a batch of 46 Starlink satellites into space. Then in April 2021, NASA tasked SpaceX with developing one of the most crucial aspects of the Artemis 3 mission to return American astronauts to the moon for the first time in over half-century. the Human Landing System, or HLS. This is the spacecraft that will lower humans to the lunar surface while NASA's Orion capsule remains in orbit around the moon. Orion, developed at a cost of $20.4 billion, is NASA's next-generation human spaceflight capsule. The plan for Artemis 3 is for SpaceX's huge upcoming Starship rocket and Orion to rendezvous in orbit around the moon. 2 astronauts from the 4-person crew would then transfer to Starship and descend to the lunar surface. Once they're done, Starship will launch the 2 astronauts back into orbit, where they'll transfer back into Orion and travel home. SpaceX must keep in step with NASA and develop Starship from a rocket that is not yet flown into one that's capable of supporting human crews and carrying out a lunar landing. And now, according to the latest update from Nelson, SpaceX is on track to achieve it. NASA was hoping to launch its huge Space Launch System rocket, SLS, on the backbone of the Artemis program on a test flight called Artemis 1 on September 3rd. But technical faults delayed that attempt as well as the previous one. It's unclear when the space agency will attempt another launch. If successful, the launch would mark the start of the Artemis program, which aims to return humans to the moon by 2025 with the help of private companies like SpaceX. NASA has spent 12 years and $23 billion developing SLS alone, and that's not taking into account the Orion capsule. In contrast, SpaceX developed Starship so fast that it went from blowing up steel prototypes in 2020 to just being weeks away from an orbital flight, potentially before 2023. In addition, SpaceX says that when Starship does fly, it'll be significantly more powerful than SLS, producing a claimed 17 million pounds of thrust to SLS's 9.5 million. Nelson says he does not see this as a threat. Quote, "The fact is, we've got a rocket that's human-related," he said. "I'm a huge fan of what these commercial companies not only have done but will do. SpaceX has been very successful in getting Starship ready, but Starship goes to the moon and it's got a rendezvous in a lunar polar orbit with Orion and the crew transfer and then go down and come back up. But Starship's not capable at that point of getting back to Earth. Only Orion is capable of getting back to Earth." Looking ahead, NASA's budget suggests it's committed to building up private spaceflight even more. According to the agency's 2021 fiscal report, they plan to spend around 80% of its budgeting on contracting. It's unclear if that's set to increase or decrease, but with the agency's goal of getting to Mars by the 2040s, significant investment is likely. Like Nelson said, "So I want Blue Origin, I want SpaceX, I want all of the other companies to be successful because I want as many opportunities for us to explore the cosmos as possible. And because of that, I think it's a very exciting time for venturing out into the universe." Well, that just about wraps it up for today's episode. Don't forget, subscribe, press that like button, share your ideas in the comments section down below. Why? Because your support motivates us to make more quality videos. And for that, we thank you so much and hope to see you next time.